In the quiet corners of Vermont's fog-drenched hills, history hides stories too terrifying to be told around a campfire. Some tales were buried with the families who lived them, while others echo in the silence of abandoned chapels, rotting pews, and cracked stained glass. One such story lingers from the year 1901, a family known for their devotion, yet remembered only for their screams that no one ever heard. Tonight, we step inside the McDonald's Chapel, a place where prayers were whispered but never returned, where silence itself became a predator. In the winter of 1901, the McDonald's family stood apart from the rest of Vermont's rural communities, not by wealth or stature, but by the depth of their faith, a devotion so consuming that it transformed their household into something more akin to a cloistered sect than a simple family unit. James MacDonald, the patriarch, was a stern man with a towering presence, known for his unyielding commitment to religious practice. His wife, Martha, mirrored his intensity, carrying herself with a quiet severity that spoke louder than any sermon. Their children, 5 in number, were raised under this same shadow of devotion, molded into obedient vessels of prayer and silence. What made the McDonalds remarkable and eventually unforgettable was the private chapel they built beside their farmhouse, an austere wooden structure that seemed out of place amidst the vast wilderness. It was not large nor grand, but it carried with it an ominous weight, as though it had been erected not for worship, but for confinement. Neighbors wondered why the family insisted on worshipping apart, avoiding the community church in favor of their secluded sanctuary. Rumors grew, whispers that the family believed the outside world's prayers had been corrupted and only within their consecrated walls could true salvation be reached. The chapel became the center of their existence, a place where the children were made to kneel for hours in silence, where James's sermons would stretch long into the night, and where the creak of the wooden pews and the flickering of candles replaced the comfort of laughter or music. For those few who were permitted a glimpse inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air carried the heavy scent of wax and damp wood, and the windows, narrow and arched, let in only slivers of daylight, ensuring the family always seemed enveloped in twilight. The sound of prayer never drifted from its doors. Instead, the only thing anyone recalled hearing was silence, an unnatural, almost crushing silence that lingered, even when the wind howled through the valley. The McDonalds believed, it was said, that their prayers were not to be heard by men, nor even by each other, but only by God, and so they whispered in tones so faint that even standing close one could not discern words, only the shape of mouths moving in unison. Yet some who lived nearby swore that even those whispers were not returned, that something within those walls absorbed sound like a sponge soaks water, swallowing the voices of those who dared to speak inside. The family's devotion grew into obsession. The children rarely played in the fields anymore. Instead, they were seen walking in single file to the chapel each dawn, their heads bowed, their lips pressed tightly together. Martha kept to the household duties in silence, refusing to greet passing neighbors, while James became more reclusive, emerging only to collect firewood or tend to livestock before vanishing back into the chapel's shadow. For the McDonalds, faith was not a comfort, but a discipline, one that demanded sacrifice, and little by little, the family's connection to the outside world dissolved. It was said that James had begun preaching that the chapel itself was a vessel chosen by God, a place where prayers would not rise into the air but be stored within the wood, saved for the day of reckoning. If that was true, then the chapel was not merely a structure, but a prison for the voices of the family. Each whispered plea, each whispered hymn locked away in silence, never to be heard again. By late summer, the McDonald's isolation had become complete. The townsfolk who once stopped by to trade goods no longer bothered, unsettled by the lifeless expressions of the children and the eerie stillness of the chapel whenever they approached. Some claimed that when standing outside its doors, they could feel a pressure in their chest, as though the air itself resisted their breathing. One farmer, after delivering flour to the family, returned pale and shaken, insisting that though the door of the chapel had been ajar, he had heard nothing from within, not the shifting of bodies, not the scrape of shoes, not even the crackle of candle flames. It was as though sound itself ceased to exist inside. He told others that when he tried to whisper a prayer for them, his own voice caught in his throat, stolen before it ever left his lips. Such accounts fed the growing unease, and soon the McDonalds were no longer thought of as a pious family, but as a household touched by something darker, something that turned their devotion into silence too deep to be natural. The chapel became a symbol of dread, its windows reflecting the dim light like watchful eyes, its door always seeming slightly open, inviting yet warning at the same time. Children were warned not to wander near the property, and travelers spoke of a strange heaviness that settled on the road whenever they passed by. Still, the McDonalds continued their rituals, vanishing into their chapel day after day, night after night, as though consumed by a vow that none could break. Neighbors began to count the days since they had last heard laughter from the household, and soon they realized it had been years since the McDonalds had shared anything but silence with the world beyond their chapel's walls. When the first whispers of the McDonalds' disappearance began to ripple through the small Vermont town in 1901, they carried with them a weight heavier than mere gossip. For months, neighbors had noticed the family's growing withdrawal, their lives consumed by the solitary chapel that seemed to feed on their devotion. Then, suddenly, there were no signs of life at all. The livestock wandered the fields unattended, the smoke no longer rose from the farmhouse chimney, and the soundless rhythm of their days ceased altogether. At first, people assumed the family had taken ill or traveled in secrecy, but the unease was too strong, the air around their property too heavy, to allow for such simple explanations. A group of townsfolk, reluctant yet compelled, gathered the courage to enter the McDonalds chapel, and what they found remains one of Vermont's most chilling, unsolved mysteries. Inside, the chapel was untouched, every object in its place, the air still thick with the waxy scent of extinguished candles. On the altar, several candles remained upright and lit, their flames steady and undisturbed, as though they had been burning for hours or days, without ever dwindling. The pews were aligned neatly, unmarked by dust or disarray, yet not a single member of the McDonald family was anywhere to be found. The absence of the family was unsettling enough, but it was the silence of the chapel that haunted those who entered. It was not the ordinary stillness of an empty room, but something far more suffocating, as if the very walls absorbed the sound of footsteps and breaths. Even when the townsfolk tried to speak, their voices seemed to vanish the moment the words left their mouths, swallowed whole before echo could form. This uncanny silence unsettled them so deeply that several refused to step further inside, lingering at the threshold with their hearts pounding. Those who remained noticed details that unsettled them further: open hymnals upon the pews, a rosary abandoned mid-prayer, and impressions on the kneelers as though the family had only moments before been bent in devotion. It was as if they had evaporated in unison, leaving behind every sign of life except for their own bodies. Some said the sight of those burning candles chilled them most of all, for fire should flicker and falter, but here it burned without sound or movement, as though time itself stood still. Word spread quickly through the town, each retelling adding layers of dread. The idea that an entire family could vanish without disturbance was one thing, but the suggestion that they had been swallowed by their own chapel was another altogether. Farmers swore they would not walk within sight of the building, claiming the silence clung to them even at a distance, muting the creak of their wagons and the calls of their horses. Hunters who ventured near the woods surrounding the McDonald property reported that birds never sang there and that no rustle of wind moved through the trees. Some believed the family had fallen victim to madness, retreating so deeply into their rituals that they carried out some unholy pact of sacrifice. Others whispered that the chapel itself was alive, that it had consumed the McDonalds in exchange for the countless prayers it had absorbed over the years. The disappearance was not merely the absence of life, but the presence of something inexplicable, something that left the chapel as intact and orderly as if the family had only just risen from their prayers to step outside for a moment, though they never returned. The authorities, pressured by growing panic, attempted their own investigation. They scoured the chapel, farmhouse, and surrounding fields, but no evidence surfaced. No footprints marked the ground beyond the doorway. No possessions were taken. No signs of a struggle existed. The family's clothing remained in the house, meals half prepared on the kitchen table, and tools left scattered in the barn as though frozen mid-use. Every detail suggested that the McDonalds had not planned to leave, and yet they were gone, leaving behind a scene suspended in eerie perfection. Some investigators stayed inside the chapel longer than they wished, unnerved by the strange sensation that their own thoughts became muffled, as if their minds too were being swallowed by the same silence that had taken the family. When they emerged, they described feeling lightheaded, drained, as though they had been robbed of something intangible. None of them dared to stay long enough to see if the silence would take more than just sound. The chapel, once the McDonald's sanctuary, quickly became a place of fear. It was locked and abandoned, but locks could not keep away the stories. Locals claimed that, on certain nights, faint figures could be glimpsed through the chapel's narrow windows, shapes bent in prayer, unmoving, with their faces obscured in shadow. Others swore that if you placed your ear against the wood of the door, you could hear muffled voices, not in conversation, but in endless murmured prayers, too low to decipher. Whether hallucinations, tricks of fear, or something more sinister, no one could agree. The only certainty was that the McDonalds were never found, and the chapel remained untouched, its interior preserved like a shrine to absence. Parents warned their children that should they wander near the chapel and dare to speak aloud, their voices too would be stolen, joining the McDonalds in eternal silence. The very idea became a kind of folklore, passed down with a shudder, a reminder that faith twisted too tightly can become a snare, and that sometimes silence is not peace but a consuming void. What unsettled the community most after the McDonald's disappearance was not just the emptiness of their home or the stillness of their land, but the chilling belief that their chapel had never been a vessel for prayers at all. The structure itself, plain and unadorned, seemed to hold within its walls something that resisted the very act of worship. The locals began to say that the chapel had been swallowing voices for years, absorbing every hymn, every whispered plea, every word of scripture, until there was nothing left but silence. When neighbors recalled their rare visits to the family, they spoke of stepping into that building and being struck dumb by the unnatural quiet. It was not simply that prayers were too faint to hear, it was as though sound itself was erased before it could even form, leaving only a pressing void that weighed upon the chest. The McDonalds, in their relentless devotion, mistook this absence of sound for holiness, believing the silence itself was God's reply. To them, it was sacred, proof that they had found a space untouched by earthly corruption, a place where only pure intention could survive. But to those outside their faith, the silence was suffocating, uncanny, and it grew harder to dismiss the thought that the chapel itself was devouring everything poured into it. The more the story spread, the more people remembered strange experiences they had chosen to forget. One woman claimed she had once stood at the chapel door and heard the faint sound of weeping, but when she opened the door, the sound ceased instantly, leaving her in oppressive stillness. Another insisted he had heard the McDonald children singing one morning, but as he drew near, the sound faded, replaced by a void that made him doubt he had ever heard it at all. These recollections painted the chapel not as a holy place, but as a kind of abyss, a structure that did not allow voices to escape, but instead consumed them, trapping them forever within its walls. Some whispered that this was why the McDonalds ceased attending the town church, why they isolated themselves so completely. They were convinced their own chapel had been chosen, that only within its wooden shell could their prayers reach the divine, when in truth nothing ever left its confines. Those who believed the chapel was cursed said that every word spoken inside was stolen, every cry for salvation absorbed, leaving the family not uplifted but drained, until eventually they were nothing more than hollow vessels themselves. As tales of the chapel's appetite grew, so did its reputation. Locals began to speak of the building as though it were alive, not with spirit, but with hunger. Some said that when standing close to its walls, one could feel a faint vibration, as though the wood itself hummed with the voices it had consumed. Others swore that in the dead of night, if you pressed your hand against the boards, you could feel a subtle warmth, like breath rising from within. The theory that the chapel had grown fat on prayers, too heavy with unreturned devotion, became the explanation most readily accepted by those unwilling to believe in vanishings without cause. It was easier to say the family had been swallowed by their own sanctuary than to accept that they had vanished without trace. The image of the chapel as a predator in disguise, a silent beast feeding on faith, rooted itself in the imagination of the community. They began to avoid the road leading past it, leaving the building to rot in solitude, convinced that even a glance toward its windows might allow it to take something from them. The legend took on darker tones as years passed. Travelers who had never known the McDonalds were warned to steer clear, told that the chapel could snatch not only the sound of a voice but the soul itself. Some said that each prayer it absorbed had only made it stronger, hungrier, until finally it had taken the family whole. They were no longer people, but whispers within the walls, a chorus trapped in eternal devotion, their lips forever moving in silence. A few even claimed that the chapel could be heard on stormy nights, not with the roar of thunder or the howl of wind, but with faint murmurs carried across the valley, murmurs that ended abruptly when anyone drew close. These accounts fueled the belief that the McDonald's Chapel was not built on consecrated ground but on cursed earth, that James McDonald's fervor had blinded him to the truth that he was feeding his family's very essence into something that did not give back. In time, the story ceased to be about one family's disappearance and instead became about the danger of devotion placed in the wrong vessel, a warning about places where silence is not peace but consumption. Even skeptics found it difficult to explain away the tales. If the chapel's silence were merely acoustics, why did even the boldest men return pale and shaken, speaking of the suffocating pressure on their chests and the inability to hear their own voices? If the disappearance of the family was simple abandonment, why was nothing ever disturbed, no sign of departure visible, no bodies ever found? The absence of answers allowed the legend to grow, each retelling adding to the sense that the chapel was a mouth that had swallowed everything given to it. The McDonalds believed they had built a sanctuary, but what remained was a husk of wood and stone that carried with it the terror of knowing that faith can be devoured, that prayers can vanish into nothingness, and that silence itself may be the loudest reply a person can ever receive. The stories that spread after the McDonald's disappearance were not just about the family itself, but about the experiences of those who later passed by their chapel and swore they encountered things no ordinary mind could explain. For years, locals avoided the path near the property, but travelers who were unaware of its reputation occasionally wandered too close and returned with unsettling tales. One merchant who had lost his way late one evening said he stopped to rest by the road and saw a faint glow emanating from the chapel windows. At first, he assumed it was candlelight, a sign that someone lived there still, but when he stepped nearer, the glow seemed to pulse, dimming and brightening like a breath. He swore that as he approached, the night grew silent. No crickets, no wind, no sound of his own boots striking the earth. Then, through the faint crack of the wooden door, he heard the unmistakable sound of muffled weeping. The sound rose and fell like a chorus of people praying through tears, yet when he summoned the courage to pull the door open, he found nothing. The pews were empty, the altar bare, the glow extinguished as though it had never been there. Terrified, he ran until he found the road again, and he never returned to that part of Vermont. Other accounts followed similar patterns, feeding the belief that the McDonalds had not simply vanished, but had somehow become trapped within the walls of the chapel. Children who dared each other to creep near its steps claimed they could see shadowy figures kneeling in the pews through the thin, dusty windows, their forms shifting in the candlelight, though no flame had been lit in years. Farmers spoke of passing by during the dawn and hearing faint chanting, only for it to dissolve into silence the moment they tried to listen closely. These strange encounters wove themselves into the fabric of local folklore until the chapel was seen not as an abandoned building, but as a place alive with something spectral, a vessel that still echoed with the remnants of the McDonald's devotion. People stopped referring to the family in the past tense and instead began to speak of them as if they lingered still, forever repeating their prayers, their voices muffled and distorted as though submerged underwater. The most disturbing accounts came from those who dared to set foot inside after the family's disappearance. One young man, determined to prove the legends false, entered the chapel on a dare and claimed he could barely stay inside for more than a few moments. He described the air as heavy, almost impossible to breathe, and though he stood alone, he heard the rustle of clothing and the faint creak of pews shifting, as if unseen bodies filled the room around him. When he whispered a curse to mock the stories, his own voice did not sound like his own. It was muffled, warped, and seemed to echo back at him from the walls in a tone far deeper than he had spoken. He stumbled out in terror, swearing he felt invisible hands pressing against his shoulders, trying to drag him down onto his knees. For months afterward, he claimed to dream of the chapel each night, waking with the memory of voices praying in a language he could not understand. These reports gave rise to the belief that the McDonald's Chapel had become a trap, not just for the family, but for anyone foolish enough to step inside and disturb the silence. The building itself came to be regarded as cursed, its hunger unending, drawing in sound, life, and even the will of those who lingered too long. Townsfolk said that the chapel did not want to be ignored, it wanted to be fed. It lured travelers with strange lights, beckoned children with glimpses of shadowy figures and held the curious captive with its suffocating silence. Some claimed the longer a person stayed inside, the harder it was to leave, as though the chapel tried to weave them into its walls, adding their whispers to the countless others it had swallowed. The thought that the McDonalds were not gone but trapped in this endless loop of devotion, their bodies lost but their voices lingering, was enough to convince most people never to test the stories for themselves. Still, curiosity is difficult to suppress. Decades after the family's disappearance, when the legend had grown into a tale retold at firesides, a few daring souls attempted to disprove the myths. They went armed with lanterns, notebooks, and bravado, determined to return with evidence that the chapel was nothing more than wood and stone. But their stories only added fuel to the growing dread. One group claimed they set their lanterns inside and found that the flames burned without sound, the crackle of fire snuffed out though the light remained. Another swore that no matter how long they stayed, the air remained still and unmoving, as if they were trapped beneath glass. They left shaken, unable to explain why their own conversations seemed to grow quieter with each passing minute, until they had to strain to hear one another's voices. The more they spoke of it afterward, the more convinced they became that the silence was not absence but presence, something alive and listening, waiting for them to return. These strange encounters cemented the legend of the chapel that swallowed prayers, a place where the McDonald's faith had been twisted into eternal bondage. To the community, it was no longer just an abandoned building but a warning etched into wood and stone, a reminder of what happens when silence becomes devotion and devotion becomes obsession. Those who passed by hurried their steps, refusing to look too long at its windows for fear they might glimpse something staring back. The chapel endured, decaying yet undiminished, carrying within it the weight of prayers never answered, voices never heard, and the lingering sense that the McDonald's fate was not one of disappearance but of eternal imprisonment within the silence they had mistaken for God. The legacy of the McDonald's chapel lingered long after the family was declared gone, transforming from a tragedy into a tale that generations passed down with a mixture of fear and fascination. It became more than a building. It was a place that shaped the culture of the surrounding valley, a warning whispered to children and a reminder to adults of how faith could twist into something unrecognizable. Farmers who once worked the nearby fields abandoned them, claiming the land never yielded crops as it should, as though the soil itself had absorbed the same silence that consumed the family. Entire tracts of farmland were left untouched, weeds overtaking fences, until the property became a scar upon the landscape. Over time, the chapel itself began to rot, its wood blackened by weather, its windows cracked and jagged, yet even in its decay, it stood as if defying time, its crooked frame leaning but never collapsing. The longer it endured, the more people believed it was not simply a structure, but a vessel, holding not just the memory of the McDonald's, but the echo of every soul that had ever stepped inside. Folklore grew from this belief, and soon the chapel became a story parents told their children to keep them close to home at night. They said if you dared to enter and whisper a prayer, it would never leave your lips, taken instead by the unseen force that lived within the walls. They warned that once the chapel took your prayer, it would also take something of you, your breath, your memory, your voice, until you were nothing more than a shadow kneeling alongside the McDonald's. Others said the family had not been swallowed all at once, but piece by piece, each visit to the chapel draining them further until they finally disappeared entirely, absorbed into the silence they mistook for divine presence. This idea took root, becoming the explanation for every eerie sound or sight near the abandoned building. If a hunter's dog refused to go near it, people said the animal sensed the whispers of the family within. If a traveler claimed to hear sobbing on the wind, they said it was Martha McDonald, still praying for her children. Every unexplained moment became evidence that the chapel was still alive, still hungry, still waiting. Even those who claimed disbelief found themselves shaken when confronted with the chapel's shadow. Visitors described the way the air felt heavy around it, pressing on their chests like a weight, making it difficult to breathe or think clearly. Some said that standing at its doorway filled them with a compulsion to kneel, to bow their heads, to submit to the same ritual the McDonald's had once performed endlessly. They believed the family's devotion had become contagious, that the chapel lured the faithful not with promises of salvation, but with the command of silence. The more they resisted, the stronger the pressure became, until retreat was the only way to escape. Over time, fewer people dared even to approach the building, allowing nature to reclaim the land, though never fully erasing it. The chapel remained like a wound that refused to heal, surrounded by tangled weeds and skeletal trees, yet still standing, unbroken by years of storms and decay. The story of the McDonalds and their chapel reached beyond the valley as travelers carried it to neighboring towns, and soon it became part of Vermont's darker folklore. Writers of local histories recorded it with unease, some treating it as a cautionary tale about fanaticism, others as evidence of something unholy lurking in the quiet corners of New England. Ghost hunters and seekers of the macabre eventually began to visit, drawn by the legend of the place where prayers were swallowed whole. Some claimed to record strange sounds on their instruments, faint murmurs too low for the ear, while others left in terror after experiencing the oppressive silence firsthand. One man wrote that he had entered to prove the stories false and tried to recite a psalm aloud, but the words failed him, his voice crumbling into nothingness before the second line. He described leaving the chapel unable to speak for hours afterward, his throat raw as though the air had stripped the sound from him. Such accounts only deepened the mystery, ensuring that the legend of the McDonalds would never fade. In the end, the family's story became inseparable from the chapel itself, their names spoken in the same breath as the structure that outlived them. Where they had once been farmers and neighbors, they were now remembered as spectral figures trapped in endless prayer, victims of a silence too powerful to escape. The chapel stood as their tomb, though no bodies had ever been found, and each creak of its rotting timbers was said to echo with their voices. Even now, some claim that on certain nights when the fog settles over the valley, you can see faint candlelight flickering in the broken windows and hear the muffled sound of devotion carried on the air, as if the family is still inside, bound to their chapel, repeating the prayers that were never heard, never answered, swallowed whole by the silence that became their eternity.